Welcome to the Molecules and Minerals podcast. I'm Stephen Goldman. I'm a former trial lawyer, corporate director, executive, and a biotech investor. I'm here again with Yuval Cohen, PhD. He's the CEO of Corbus Pharmaceuticals Holdings, Inc., that trades on NASDAQ, symbol CRBP. It's a clinical stage biotech company advancing two lead investigational drugs, one in oncology and the other for the treatment of obesity. I'm following up my initial April 19th interview with Yuval, where we discussed Yuval's background as well as Corbus's background story and brought listeners up to speed on Corbus's potentially exciting pipeline developments. I'll post a link to that interview in my notes below. So Corbus's pipeline includes CRB-701, that's a next-generation antibody-drug conjugate, or ADC, that targets the expression of Nectin-4 on cancer cells. Corbus is currently focused on advancing CRB-701 in treating two forms of cancer which express high levels of Nectin-4 and are primarily driven by the human papillomavirus, or HPV. The first is oropharyngeal squamous cell carcinoma, a subset of head and neck cancer, and the second is cervical cancer. I just want to remind listeners that Corbus obtained a license from CSPC Pharmaceutical Group, that's a Chinese company, to develop and commercialize CRB-701 in the United States, Canada, the European Union, and the United Kingdom and Australia, and that will become relevant later in this discussion. And secondly, CRB-913, which is a CB1 receptor inverse agonist for the treatment of obesity. It has a mechanism of action which is different from the GLP-1s, with a potentially best-in-class efficacy and safety profile, at least based on preclinical and very early and small human studies. Corbus expects a top-line readout from a phase 1b dose range finding study called Canyon-1 with CRB-913 in September. This trial is treating 240 U.S. patients randomized into 4 arms over a 12-week treatment period, followed by a 4-week safety follow-up. A positive readout of the study could be a major catalyst for Corbus. The reason I wanted to interview Yuval again was that Corbus presented CRB-701 phase 1/2 clinical data at the end of May 2026 at the American Society of Clinical Oncology conference known as ASCO. This was CRB-701. It's a phase 1/2 monotherapy data in second-line setting in both head and neck squamous cell carcinoma, and with stratification data showing the clinical difference between head and neck squamous cell cancer on an all-comers basis versus those who had oropharyngeal or throat cancer with high levels of Nectin-4. The data was also broken down by patients who had oropharyngeal cancer tumors, of which about 85% were HPV-positive. The clinical results in oropharyngeal cancer was, as expected, very encouraging, and as I had hoped it would be. Corbus also presented very encouraging CRB-701 clinical data in cervical cancer, and that was the subject of an oral presentation at ASCO, which was also very encouraging. So despite my belief on how positive all of the CRB-701 ASCO data was, Corbus's share price plummeted more than 30% following that May 26 press release. And I was surprised. I reached out to Yuval and asked what I was missing. And he replied, I was missing nothing. So the CRB-701 clinical data in head and neck, as stratified, again, was very positive. And what I gather was the market was upset because it had expected overall better results in head and neck cancer generally, regardless of whether the patient was suffering from oropharyngeal throat cancer, and perhaps just didn't appreciate how large that growing cancer was, both in second and first line. So this is really what I want to talk to Yuval about. So CRB-701 targets Nectin-4 and really should be more effective in cancers with high Nectin-4 expression, which happens to be highly correlated with HPV-positive cancers. So the oropharyngeal subtype again has high Nectin-4 expression and generally 85% or so HPV positive. And that's in contrast to non-HPV positive head and neck cancer patients, which have a much lower Nectin-4 expression and therefore did not respond as positively. And that's exactly what we expected. And then following the presentation of Corbus's data at ASCO on June 1st, Corbus held a KOL, that's Key Opinion Leader panel discussion with 3 preeminent oncologists who practice in the area of head and neck cancers. And they discussed this unmet need for these HPV-positive oropharyngeal patients and Corbus's clinical results. They're very bullish on CRB-701, and they really talked about that it was a very different type of cancer than other types of head and neck cancers. And they talked about this great unmet need where precisely CRB-701 could fit in. So oropharyngeal squamous cell cancer, or OPSCC, now represents a growing and perhaps a majority of head and neck squamous cell cancers in the United States and perhaps the Western world, and continues to rise. And these patients are overwhelmingly men, and they're otherwise fit and healthy in their 40s and 50s, and who by the time they reach second-line treatment for recurrent or metastatic OPSCC, they have very few options. And they're very highly motivated to seek a better treatment option, such as what CRB-701 might offer if clinical trials prove successful. And I'll also post a link to that June 1 KOL discussion in my notes below. It's also available on Corbus's website. So Corbus now is on track to commence a registrational trial this summer with CRB-701 in monotherapy in second-line OPSCC in some 250 men, with CRB-701 in monotherapy in one arm and investigator's choice in the second arm, and with an anticipated readout in the first half of 2028. And after discussion with the FDA, the overall response rate is a primary endpoint for accelerated approval and overall survival as an endpoint for full marketing approval. Corbus also expects to read out a phase 1/2 trial with CRB-701 in combination with Keytruda in first-line OPSCC in Q1 of 2027. And for the reasons that I think Yuval is going to discuss, that could be very promising indeed. So, Yuval, thank you again for agreeing to be my guest today. So let's first discuss the clinical data that Corbus presented at ASCO. I would really like to get into an explanation of why CRB-701 is so well suited for the treatment of oropharyngeal squamous cell carcinoma.
Steven, thank you again for having me on your podcast. It remains 100% of the only podcast I've ever been on, so I'm delighted to keep that tradition.
Great.
And I really enjoyed our previous conversation. I think your summary was very accurate. What we showed at ASCO is 2 specific tumor types, head and neck and cervical. It really is a continuation of the data that we presented at ESMO, the European Oncology Conference in November. And so it's basically the same patients as a few more that have joined since that are just stretched out for longer periods, so with longer observation periods. And some things remained reassuringly the same. The ocular toxicity we saw at ASCO hasn't changed much since then, and that's reassuring. We have durability data for the first time. ESMO's data set was too short of a duration to ascertain durability data. For the first time, we have durability, and it certainly looks encouraging. This is a drug that is both tolerated sufficiently long enough and efficaciously sufficiently long enough to actually have meaningful clinical durability. I think the biggest novelty of the data set was in head and neck, where for the first time we had enough data to start to stratify our head and neck patients, what's called all-comers population, into different subtypes. And the subtype that came up as being highly relevant for stratification are the oropharyngeal or throat cancer versus the non-oropharyngeal. And so the first question is why? And you've addressed it, but I just want to dig in a little bit more into that. Why is our ADC seemingly so different in terms of its efficacy in oropharyngeal cancer versus in non-oropharyngeal, but still head and neck cancer? And it has to do with the fact that the two diseases are actually quite different. And the nomenclature itself is sort of anachronistic, and we wonder out loud if at some stage the nomenclature will change. I'll start with the non-oropharyngeal head and neck cancer. So what is it? Who are those patients? Those patients tend to be elderly. So imagine a 75-year-old, typically man, grandfather, and they have a history of excessive, sometimes very excessive, cigarette smoking and or alcohol consumption. And so after decades, typically, of smoking cigarettes, sadly, in their 60s and their 70s, and sometimes even older than that, they finally develop a tumor as a result of that tobacco consumption or alcohol consumption. And that tumor would be somewhere around their face or their oral cavity or the front of their tongue. And that's your classic head and neck cancer. That is still by far the majority of patients outside the West. So if you think, Steven, of places like China, that's probably 90% of Chinese head and neck. A reminder to our audience, 1 in 2 Chinese adults smoke cigarettes. So very, very heavy consumption of cigarettes. Places like India, places like big parts of South America or Eastern Europe, anywhere you find people who have a history of smoking and drinking, you're going to find that type of non-throat cancer. And then there's this other population, which is completely unrelated. They are the oropharyngeal cancer. So technically, how one is defined as oropharyngeal. And Steven, I want you to imagine a tumor that starts anywhere from your back teeth and the back of your tongue to the top of your throat. That's your oropharyngeal cancer. And what's interesting about those patients is they're very, very different. They're younger. On average, they're 12 years younger, but you can find them as early as in their 30s now. They are overwhelmingly men. I think it's about 8 men to 1 woman, the ratio. And they have no history of smoking or excessive alcohol abuse, right? And so what happened to them? Why are they developing this very different type of cancer in a very different part of their body? And as you intimated, they have HPV. So a reminder to the audience, what is HPV? HPV is human papillomavirus. It is an STD. It is a sexually transmitted virus. And it is the most common, by far, STD that humans have. Just before our conversation, Steven, I went and looked up the latest numbers, and the latest assumptions are in the US, something like 85% of adults at some stage in their adult life will have contracted HPV. Now, why is it that most of us have never even heard of it? And the answer is it's usually completely asymptomatic, or the symptom is a little wart and then it goes away. The vast majority of people who've contracted HPV will have no ill outcomes because of it. Most of them will clear it out naturally. And it's really, in that sense, perfectly harmless. The problem are the ones where it's not harmless. And what HPV does to humans is it can trigger certain very specific cancers. In men, overwhelmingly men, that's your oropharyngeal cancer. And in women, it's cervical cancer. So these are 2 cancers that are very, very problematic, to say the least, and that are most commonly associated with their origin with an HPV infection. There are a number of other cancers, Steven, that are HPV driven. Unsurprisingly, they have to do with having sex. They just tend to be very, very rare. So, for example, penile cancer, there's something called labial cancer or anal cancers. These are all three cancers, by the way, with very, very poor prognosis. Thankfully, they're very rare. But the common ones are throat cancer in men and cervical cancer in women. I'm going to stop for a second, Steven, and any follow-up questions, because that was an awfully long answer.
Well, no, it's a good answer. And I guess from the time that we had first talked back in April until the other day, and I did call you about this, one of the things I had raised with you is, specifically what type of sexual activity was causing this. And again, because we have primarily men who have this throat cancer, and we discussed the fact that it was oral sex. And then I looked at some articles, and oral sex is now the leading risk factor for throat cancer. Any comments about that? Is the type of sexual activity we're seeing in the Western world, and I'm using the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, is that different than what is practiced in, for example, China?
Without channeling my inner Dr. Ruth, which I wouldn't even be able to do, it is fascinating, right? It's human activity that drives a disease outcome. It's super interesting. And so the answer is emphatically yes. I'll start by saying that for the average person in the street, if they even have any sort of knowledge around throat cancer and HPV and sex, it's maybe because a couple of years ago they read that Michael Douglas was diagnosed with throat cancer. That was sort of the one celebrity event that anyone ever remembers around this. And so the what you have is in men. So really, the throat cancer really is the male equivalent of cervical cancer in women. And so in men, it's driven, unsurprisingly, by oral sex. As you can imagine, that anal cancer is driven by anal sex. And in women, of course, it's vaginal sex in terms of cervical. And different places have different cultural taboos or preferences or what have you that drive it. Another thing to discuss, which is really important, is there's a vaccine, right? It's one of those vaccines that really works. I don't think there's anyone who argues that the HPV vaccine does not work. But the problem, as you can imagine, is it only works if you're vaccinated prior to ever being infected. And so the population we vaccinate are teenagers, right? And one of the challenges that we have, or there's a number of challenges. So the vaccine is fabulously effective at preventing HPV-driven tumor types, really fabulously effective. But there's a couple of problems. The one is, even if tomorrow, somehow, miraculously, we vaccinated every single teenager on the planet, just every teenager got vaccinated.
And that's both male and female.
Correct. And remember, we vaccinate overwhelmingly girls for HPV.
Yeah.
Because when we think of the HPV vaccine, we think of cervical cancer. Not a lot of people think of throat cancer in men. And so if we were to vaccinate absolutely every single teenager on the planet tomorrow, it wouldn't be till about 2050 that the curves would start to flatten out, because there's such a lag from infection to the manifestation of the cancer. So for men, remember, the throat cancer starts to show up in their 50s and 60s. That's, let's just assume, for argument's sake, 30 years at least since you started to become sexually active, or 30-something years since you've, could have been vaccinated.
Sure.
And so one day, probably not in our lifetimes, we will live in a world that might actually be free of this cancer type. We are decades and decades and decades and decades away from that.
What was actually interesting from your KOL panel discussion was there was talk about this. The slide I have up clearly shows a rapid increase in the incidence of oropharyngeal squamous cell carcinoma over the last number of decades. And it's gone from like 11% up to, we'll call it 57% of all head and neck cancers in a relatively short period of time. We see a really rapid increase. And at the same time, because of the increase in vaccinations, which is certainly far from complete these days for various reasons, the incidence of cervical cancer has really declined. So it seems currently the market for oropharyngeal cancer is actually much larger than cervical cancer.
It is. It's, to be fair, it always has been in terms of the totality of head and neck. The dynamic is interesting, and there's more to this. If we think of head and neck, it's the sum of non-oropharyngeal and oropharyngeal.
Okay.
In the West, and again, we have to emphasize it because it's one of those where the global numbers are actually relevant. In the West, what we're seeing is the non-oropharyngeal is shrinking. The reason is, Steven, if you've noticed, the youth are no longer smoking or drinking. They live a very virtuous life. And so we don't, as the drinkers and the smokers, these elderly men pass away, they die off, there isn't a replacement younger generation of drinkers and smokers that can feed this morbid conveyor belt of non-oropharyngeal cancer. So that one is shrinking. Sadly, what is happening is the opposite for your HPV-positive driven oropharyngeal. There's a lot more of them every year. And so if you look at the overall numbers of head and neck cancer, they're growing by about, I think, 1%. But that 1% is the net of your non-oropharyngeal shrinking and your oropharyngeal actually increasing. We estimate that already in the US, the majority of new patients are oropharyngeal HPV positive. And again, for your audiences, for all intents and purposes, it's almost the same thing. 90% of oropharyngeal are HPV positive, only 4% of non-oropharyngeal HPV positive. So you could use HPV positive and throat cancer almost as shorthand one for the other. It's accurate enough. And so what we're seeing is this wave of new cases every year of throat cancer. They are almost certainly already the majority in the West. At some stage, places like China, India, etc., as they stop smoking. And on the other hand, as their culture, also habits change, are probably going to see the same dynamic happening there too.
Right. By the way, this slide shows the increase in the oropharyngeal and the decrease in the smokers and drinkers, as you describe it. That's pretty incredible. So let's look at your actual data that you presented.
This is our data only, right? It's our study. This is not a reference or third-party data. And what we're looking at here is we are stratifying our all-comer data into oropharyngeal, which is on the left-hand side, and non-oropharyngeal on the right-hand side. And so think of it as the HPV-driven versus the smokers and the drinkers. The first question we ask in those two pie charts is, right, how many in each group actually have evidence of HPV infection? Now remember, there's some interesting catches here. You could have been infected in the past and cleared it, which means at the moment you are HPV negative, but you could have been infected and the damage could have been done. But nevertheless, what it fits in very, very, very nicely is what has been seen with other published data sets. Your oropharyngeal patients are overwhelmingly HPV positive. It's why they ended up there. The 15% that are HPV negative are divided in either ones who really did not get ever HPV infection and somehow they ended up with throat cancer through an orthogonal mechanism, Or people, as I said, had an infection, cleared it, but the damage is done. The damage could have been done 30 years ago, and it took 30 years for that to become an active tumor. On the right-hand side, your non-throat cancer patients, as you'd expect, your smokers and drinkers, the vast majority are HPV negative. So that's one part of it. That fits nicely. The other part of it is sort of the table underneath the pie charts. Again, our data, we got a lot of questions, which prompted us to bring in this data ahead of schedule. We were going to present this towards the end of the year, and we'll still present it in more detail at the end of the year. But what it boils down to is the following question. Is right. Is there a difference in Nectin-4 levels between these two tumor types? And what we present here is one way of looking at Nectin-4 as a biomarker is something called an H-score. And basically, Steven, you take a slice of tumor, put it under a microscope, and you stain for the exact biomarker you're looking for. And a pathologist then gives that what's called an H-score. And H-scores are typically done categorically, so above certain arbitrary thresholds. And what you're seeing there is it doesn't really matter what the threshold is. And you can call it low, medium, and high. There's always more patients at that threshold in your throat cancer population than in your non-throat cancer population. Again, we're not the first ones to find this data out. There have been a number of publications that have highlighted this. It's just very reassuring that in our case, we see the same thing. And that's why the drug works. There's no mystery here. This is literally the target of both 701. But equally interesting, we are not even the first Nectin-4 MMAE ADC to show this. And that, of course, Steven, as you know, later in the deck, is Padcev.
Sure.
And I wonder if we can jump to that section for a second.
Yeah.
Because it's really fascinating. Because in many ways, what we've done is wonderfully unoriginal, right? We've taken a Nectin-4 targeting MMAE-armed ADC into a tumor type where we're not the first ones to venture into it. The first ones to venture into it were Pfizer, although technically, I guess, Seagen started it. And this is fascinating data that was presented at ESMO last year. And I'll be the first to say, Steven, the vast majority of us missed it at the time. This is Padcev plus Keytruda in frontline head and neck. So these are patients, unlike our patients, who are treatment naive at this stage.
So Padcev is also a Nectin-4 ADC, but what I'll call a first generation. So difficult problems with their various AEs, but with and without Keytruda. So I think this is the slide you want me to bring up.
Correct. And Padcev's already approved for bladder cancer, another Nectin-4 rich tumor type, which, by the way, has nothing to do with HPV. So it's not just HPV that can cause Nectin-4. And so what we see here is Padcev plus Keytruda, all comers head and neck. And if we look at the totality of efficacy, and this is measured by objective response rate, if we look at the totality of responses across the all-comer population, it comes out to a respectable 39%. It's not the most amazing, but it's certainly a signal at 39%. To put it in perspective, Keytruda on its own in this population is about 25%, something like that. So there's definitely something there. And that was pretty much the headline people noticed at ESMO last year. What so many people missed, and I'll absolutely, in full transparency, say we also missed it because it was buried in that poster, was Pfizer, like us, stratified their patients into HPV positive or negative. And again, for all intents and purposes, it's oropharyngeal versus non-oropharyngeal. And that's where they saw really a remarkable difference in efficacy. So if we look at what they define as HPV positive, if they took Padcev plus Keytruda, they got just an astonishing, really, there is no other way of this, there's no other adjective, an astonishing response rate of 82%. You don't see a lot of response rates of 82% in oncology. It really is extraordinarily potent in that population. On the other hand, the same drug, the same combination of Padcev, a Nectin-4 ADC, plus Keytruda in your HPV negative patients barely does anything. It's barely at the level of Keytruda on its own. The Padcev does nothing in that combination. And so that in retrospect was actually the first ever evidence, well before us, that a Nectin-4 ADC should have a very strong bias towards the HPV-driven form of head and neck, which is oropharyngeal. If we go to the next slide for a second, Stephen, if we may.
Okay.
It's so much so that physicians, especially in the United States, probably only in the United States, are already using Padcev, what's called off-label, for some cases of HPV-positive patients. Now, off-label should always be treated with a certain amount of respect and reserve, of course. It means you're using a drug that is marketed for disease X in order to treat a disease that it is not approved for. That is the definition of off-label. So why are they doing it? They're doing it is because Padcev this year was included in the guidelines of recommended therapies for head and neck. And the reason it was included in the guidelines of recommended therapies is because it is an approved drug, albeit for something else, that has shown a promising signal or a promising sign of efficacy in head and neck. And that's actually based on the monotherapy data from Padcev, an earlier data set, I think that dates back to 2024, where there was a relatively modest signal of overall response, objective response rate of 24%, which is nothing to sneeze at. What we don't know about that data set is in this one, there is no stratification. We don't know if the patients who are HPV positive responded better or not. We guess that about half of them were HPV positive. But nevertheless, it has a signal. I should point out that some of the KOLs have mentioned that our own data with a different Nectin-4 MMAE ADC has also helped them in terms of thinking about targeting this disease with Padcev, which is wonderful. And as you pointed out, though, Steven, there are problems with Padcev. I'll start by saying that Pfizer last year at this European conference stated that they were not pursuing Padcev in head and neck. And the reason is most likely not in efficacy. It works really nicely. The reason has to do with tolerability. Padcev is associated with a number of adverse events that we are not, and that are quite limiting. The most problematic of their adverse events is something called peripheral neuropathy. It's typically irreversible damage to your neck, to your nerve endings, and it causes loss of ability to use, for example, your extremities and or pain, neuronal pain, which is very, very difficult to treat and often irreversible. That makes it a not well-suited drug for this population. Remember, in throat cancer, you're not talking about grandfathers, you're usually talking about dads. And they're typically working, and they're typically, as you said, Steven, in a better shape. Developing this type of disability is very difficult for them to accept. But nevertheless, Padcev, interesting enough, is your first sort of proof of concept that targeting Nectin-4 works in these oropharyngeal / HPV positive patients.
So what I saw from your previous slide, it showed that the peripheral neuropathy was 32%. That's a very high number. And I know from your own slide, it looks like you were closer to 7.3%. And even there in peripheral neuropathy, it was grade 1 or 2. So in contrast, you're a much safer profile. If you end up being anywhere close to that, now just one caveat, that was a fairly small number of patients, so that caveat. But still, if we're anything close to that, as you indicate, if you can replicate the type of differentiation in combination data, your CRB-701 plus Keytruda, and we're going to see that in oropharyngeal patients, we're hoping in Q1 of 2027. So one change that has happened since we first interviewed was back in April, the intention was that trial that's going to read out in Q1 of 2027 was going to be head and neck squamous cell cancer patients generally. But now that you've seen the data from ASCO, I understand that you're now focusing, I think, solely on oropharyngeal squamous cell cancer patients, right? So your population is now going to be Nectin-4 HPV positive group. And so it is a much more selective group that you're now treating that should be more responsive to CRB-701 plus Keytruda. So what changed?
I'd like you and your audience to think of early drug development in oncology usually as a funnel. So in fact, Steven, if you can go back to slide 6, I think. And so how do you start with develop an oncology drug? You start usually with very common, a dozen types of tumors. And that is your early phase 1 dose escalation. And at that stage, you're not selective at all. You're looking at patients with late stage cancer. You're primarily looking at safety, and almost any solid tumor is welcome in your study. What you're looking for are hits. You're looking to see which tumors are going to start responding to your drug. And then you start to whittle down this funnel, right? So we went from about a dozen tumors to initially looking at 3 that we publicly disclosed, which were bladder, head and neck, and cervical. Now at ASCO, we're down to 2 that we're publicly disclosing. And even within one of them, which is head and neck, we are further channeling this funnel into one of the 2 subgroups of the disease that exists. There is a very beautiful analogy, I think, or very elegant analogy to this within head and neck for a very different mechanism of action. And those are what's known as the EGFR bispecifics. So these are antibodies that bind to 2 targets, not just one, hence being bispecific. And there are 3 companies that have them, that are developing them, or one of them already has it on the market. So Johnson & Johnson, Bicara, and then a company called Merus that was bought out by another larger company called Genmab. And all 3 have an antibody that binds to EGFR as the one target, and then a different target as the second part of the antibody. And what's interesting about the EGFR bispecifics is they do exactly the opposite of what we do. They work really, 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 really nicely on your HPV negative population. So much so that 2 of the 3 EGFR bispecifics that are being developed in head and neck, the one from Johnson & Johnson and the one from Bicara, are not even being developed in oropharyngeal or HPV positive patients. They've just given up completely. They've gone, right, it doesn't work. We're only going to focus on the HPV negative. The Merus/Genmab is the odd man out. It started as an all-comers study, but there are indications that it is so biased in favor of HPV negative that they're having some issues trying to maintain that all-comers. And so what I think is so interesting about head and neck is the bifurcation isn't only in the patients. About half the patients in the US now are oropharyngeal, half the patients are not oropharyngeal. The bifurcation is also in the drugs that are being developed for them. And I think that one vision of the future will be if you are a non-oropharyngeal, i.e. HPV negative patient, you're almost certainly going to get one of 3 EGFR bispecifics, and that is the right drug for you. If you are oropharyngeal, I think you're not going to get 2 of them for sure because they're not even pursuing them. And I think the real question marks whether you're even going to get the 3rd one. On the other hand, for those patients, a Nectin-4 ADC might be a very, very attractive solution. Padcev, again, is not being pursued on label for that and has its limitation, and that leaves CRB-701. So the type of bias of funneling that we're seeing is exactly what happened with the EGFR bispecifics as well. They started with all-comer populations and then whittled it down to the subpopulation that works best.
Right. Well, I just want to remind listeners, talking about petosemtamab, which was purchased by Genmab, that was just recently purchased for $8 billion. And that was primarily for this one drug, and that's in phase 3 trials, right? It hasn't read out in phase 3, and it was for head and neck squamous cell cancers generally. This I find really interesting. So if you think of that kind of number, your slide 20, I'm going to go there, actually compares your results. It's CRB-701 in comparison to petosemtamab or peto in second-line HPV-positive cancers. And you can, maybe you can explain this, but it looks like on its face, again, small numbers and lots of caveats, in these HPV-positive cancers, it looks like you could have a really superior drug.
Yeah. The caveats are quite right. Small numbers for both data sets, 2 different trials. So we do a cross-trial comparison with all the caveats of that. But having said that, whereas peto works very, very, very nicely in the HPV negative, it really seems to have a much, much more modest efficacy in your, and they defined it as oropharyngeal, who are also HPV positive. And so, in fact, if we use their definition, our objective response rate is 50%. That's because, Steven, we don't limit ourselves to just being HPV positive. We simply want them to be oropharyngeal, knowing that we're going to capture roughly 90% of them being HPV positive. What's interesting is they're not the only EGFR bispecific that has shown very, very modest efficacy in oropharyngeal cancer. If we look at the EGFR bispecific from Bicara, while we don't have second-line monotherapy data, they never pursued it, we have their combination with Pembro or Keytruda in frontline. And again, what they have is the mirror image of Padcev in frontline.
Yeah.
They have in HPV-positive patients, when they target them with their drug plus Pembro, effectively the drug does nothing. It's just the Pembro efficacy. Their objective response rate is 27%.
Right.
J&J showed this a long time ago in lung cancer. They didn't even bother going after your HPV positive. Right. And hence the bifurcation, Steven, as you've mentioned. There are real questions about whether peto will succeed in getting a label for all comers head and neck, or whether they too will end up with a label like their 2 competitors, Bicara and Johnson & Johnson, which is exclusively for HPV negative patients, where undoubtedly the drug works. There's no question about it.
So just for those who may not have the benefit of actually seeing this chart, the figure was, and this is monotherapy data, again, not quite apples and apples, but reasonably close. For peto, it was only a 13% confirmed response rate compared to 50% for CRB-701 when you're just looking at HPV positive cancers. That's quite a difference, and that should also read through, presumably, if you do a combination with Keytruda.
Correct. That bias in favor of oropharyngeal is intrinsic to the drug's mechanism of action. So that should translate into the frontline in the same way that Padcev has it in the frontline.
Right, right. And by the way, your KOLs echo precisely what you're saying. They're saying the EGFRs, the bispecifics are fantastic for what I'll call HPV negative cancers, but a drug like CRB-701, so far, if the efficacy and safety profile, is shown to continue, this level of efficacy and safety looks much more appropriate for the oropharyngeal type cancers, which are HPV positive driven.
And Steven, if I can just humanize that further, what you've heard from KOLs and what we've heard from many more is there's a real tragedy for these oropharyngeal patients, right? They're younger, they're in the prime of their career. As you've mentioned, Steven, they're very, very motivated, and they're diagnosed, and they have a conversation with their oncologist, and they are informed, tragically, that while there's very, very exciting developments happening in the HPV negative form of the disease, In the HPV positive form of the disease, there really is this tragic unmet medical need.
Yeah.
And as we've mentioned, that's now probably 1 in 2 patients. In some of the clinical sites that we deal with in the United States, especially if they're in a big urban center with young professionals, etc., we are hearing anecdotally stories of sites telling us that 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10 new coming patients these days are oropharyngeal. And so this really is a very, very urgent and tragic unmet medical need.
So I just want to tie up a couple loose ends, at least in my head, in going through this. So listening to the KOLs, my understanding is, and again, this is their estimate based on the various studies, is that there's probably 7,500 to 10,000 patients in the US that would benefit from CRB 701.
It's even more than that. You started the conversation sort of with what happened after the data release. And I'd say the number one questions we've gotten was, how many patients are we talking about? And so I want to draw your attention to slide 14 for a second. This is where things like ChatGPT or even some pre-COVID publications are not quite as helpful because you often talk about global data. And as we see, the world is very, very different if you're in China versus if you are in Los Angeles or New York City or Boston.
Yeah.
And so our estimates, based on third-party research that we commissioned, as well as by some of the databases and some of the references out there, is that annually there are 23,000 patients in the US with late-stage throat cancer, late-stage oropharyngeal cancer. The late stage means that it's spread, it's too late for radiation, it's too late to excise it with surgery. All the easy solutions are gone. Now you're into, right, I've got to treat this systemically. Of those, our data shows about 18,000 of them enter the front line. In other words, 18,000 of them every year elect to have something, typically chemo or Keytruda or whatever else that they can possibly offer them hope. And of those, 14,000 move on to being potentially eligible for the next line of therapy. That's made up of 2 groups, and there's real human tragedy behind these numbers. Roughly 7,000 patients, Steven, actually elect for second-line therapy, right? A second round of some sort of therapy. But roughly an equal number elect to actually do nothing, to basically go into the hospital.
Because they don't want to have just chemotherapy.
Because the option at that stage of the game is so grim. It's just so grim. You're talking about, for example, a second round of chemo that's very difficult to tolerate and is going to buy you maybe another 2 months of life at a very low quality of life. And so part of our post-ASCO education, the majority of it has been around simply working with different audiences, whether investors or sell-siders, and educating them around how to build models. Because understandably, the EGFR bispecific companies have been saying for a while now, right, the majority of patients are HPV negative, etc. First of all, there's a very logical reason why they would say it. They say that there's nothing wrong with being self-serving. But secondly, if you look at the global number, they're right. It's still the majority that are HPV negative. What we're missing there is the very interesting specific dynamics happening in the West, which eventually will spread globally, where it's no longer the majority. In the United States today, the majority are oropharyngeal patients.
So what do you estimate the number that would potentially benefit from CRB 701, maybe firstly in the US and then perhaps in all of the jurisdictions that you have licensed?
So the total addressable annual population for us in the US is what we see on slide 14. It starts initially with second line.
Okay.
But depending on what we see early next year, we may follow in the footsteps of Pito, which
Sure.
started as a second line and moved into front line, or Steven, which is exactly the same thing that Padcev did in bladder. Padcev started as a second line monotherapy for bladder cancer and then moved into frontline with Keytruda. And so for us, the relevant numbers are the ones on slide 14 for the US. Western Europe looks very similar. It starts to look more and more different in Eastern Europe. Places like Australia will look very similar to the United States. And eventually, the rest of the world will follow suit. The nicotine consumption worldwide is dropping. So it's just a question of time.
Okay. So this is not a small number.
Not at all. No, this is, as I said, half. Just to put it in perspective, you mentioned the Merus acquisition, which was an extraordinary acquisition. Merus are looking at head and neck, frontline and second line. So again, looking at slide 14, that's the population they're looking at, realizing that in the US, the number of HPV negative patients in that setting is exactly the same as the oropharyngeal.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a big market, and that's just the United States. And then you say the rest, the jurisdictions that you have licensed are probably a similar number. So you could be up to what, closer to 30,000 patients.
Yeah, Europe is a similar population size to the United States. And so the back of the envelope is, yeah, you basically double it.
So what we have is your potential population of patients that could benefit from CRB 701 is very significant in the areas that you are licensed in, which is North America, Western Europe, Australia. We see that the competition is, I mean, you have an open laneway, and I think that's kind of the terminology you've used. I think Pfizer owns Padcev. They're not going into the head and neck space, despite the results. And Pito, which talks about going into that space, it looks like on its face, first of all, they may not get any approval in the HPV positive area, but even if they did, it looks like your data is clearly superior, again, small numbers, but just their 13% confirmed ORR in monotherapy versus your 50% is quite a divergent number. Anyways, I like the look of it. So back to the FDA. Did you speak to the FDA to get feedback so that the combination trial data that we're expecting in Q1 of 27 is now focused on oropharyngeal patients rather than head and neck generally?
So the study started as an all-comers. We've now shifted to enrolling oropharyngeal. I think it's very sensible to assume that we would have done the responsible thing and informed FDA of what we're doing. It would be very odd not to. And it's not particularly difficult to convince clinical sites to enroll patients that are more likely to respond than others. There's even, basic ethical issues here that are important. So we look forward to that data. We'll see what we get. I think the key question is, do we have the same pattern that was seen with Padcev? It's in the front line.
How many patients are enrolled in that particular trial?
Our typical cohort size or group sizes for these initial first inpatient studies tends to be about 24 patients. That's, if you look at it historically, that's about where we come out with.
Yeah.
Because what you're doing is, not to put a finer point here, but it's basically a fishing expedition, right? You're looking at patients and you're going, right, does this make sense or not? Before you decide to upsize the study and invest more resources into it.
And remind me, is there a comparative arm?
No shape or form is this like a registrational study.
Of course. Okay.
This is simply, I want to check my drug. What does it do in these patients? Is it worth putting more resources into it?
So it's going to be approximately 24 patients, first line with oropharyngeal squamous cell carcinoma. All 24 are going to be on treatment.
The treatment being our ADC plus
Keytruda. Okay. All right. I'm excited about that one. That could be very
we really look forward to it.
And your registrational trial in second line that's beginning this summer.
Yep.
That also is going to be focused solely on oropharyngeal patients. And from listening to the KOLs, they thought that that would enroll really quickly because there's so much unmet need, and there's, other than something like chemo, there's really no real alternative for these patients.
It certainly helps that there are, again, the EGFR bispecifics are sort of the biggest thing happening at the moment in head and neck, and they are not enrolling these patients. Two of them exclude them completely. And the third one has completed enrollment in that subpopulation. And so we are quite literally getting the patients, which at the moment, nobody wants, tragically.
Yeah. And this trial is going to be, is this the United States and Europe, or where are you enrolling?
Where we have done studies would be the US and Europe. It's not uncommon to add some sites in places like Australia and Korea and Taiwan, for example. You want to make sure that you have a variety of ethnicities that are involved in this. Places we avoid because they're such a heavy smoker countries would be places like China or India or South America, where unsurprisingly, the EGFR bispecifics are enrolling very aggressively.
Okay, well, look, I'm very excited about that. We've gone on for quite a long time.
We always do. There we go.
Well, I was going to talk about your cervical cancer and the others, but I think I'm happy if we sort of end focused on this area, because I
Yeah.
think this was the most controversial of the data and what kind of drove the share price decline. And I see a little bit of recovery in your share price. I remain cautiously optimistic. And as I shared with you, I actually did go out in the market and bought more shares after the ASCO data release. So just in terms of upcoming catalysts generally, what we have is this summer, you're going to initiate your registrational trial in CRB-701 in oropharyngeal squamous cell carcinoma. And hopefully we'll get some updates even on enrollment. I think that would be helpful to investors. You have your upcoming and very important data release in CRB-913 in obesity. That'll be a good one. And as I understand it, your data is coming out in September.
It's not a boring data release. We'll see what we get, right? The study is still ongoing. We're blinded. The reason it could be really interesting is because that could really be, if the data is good, that could really be disruptive in a wonderful way to the field.
I see it as kind of optionality. It is a
Correct.
potential big boost if it's successful. If it's not, it doesn't really change my own investment thesis in the company, although others may feel differently. But I see it as potentially a best-in-class type of drug, which fits where a lot of GLP-1s have some issues. So I'll just leave it at that. And then, of course, we have the data from the combination of CRB-701 and Keytruda in Q1 of 27, and that should be very exciting for the reasons we've discussed. The data that you presented at ASCO, just one minor point, it looked like you still had ongoing treatment. So we still could have updated data at some point on progression-free survival and overall survival data, and that could be materially significant. When do you think we'll get updates on those patients again?
So you don't want to do these data cuts, Stephen, too close to each other.
Sure, of course.
It's just not helpful. I think what you'll see from us is a bifurcation between the two data sets. So every time you present cervical next to head and neck, nobody notices the cervical. I think what we're going to see with cervical is we will present that at one of the dedicated gynecological oncology conferences. There's a bunch of them. They typically happen early in the year. There's one in February in Europe. There's one in April in the US as a standalone. Head and neck, Stephen, is a big oncology conference disease. There is one specific head and neck conference, but I think it's not very well attended. So it's one of these that gets to be part of the big oncology conferences. And so we'll select one that makes sense and present the data. the other challenge is happening with the calendars is some of these conferences want their abstracts so early that the data cut for an abstract is almost meaningless because it's ancient by the
Sure,
time you get to a
of
conference.
course.
So, but yeah, you're quite right. Both of these data sets still have more maturity in them. We do not have overall survival yet. It's too early to tell. And as you've mentioned, some of the other durability parameters are still maturing. So yes, this is not the end of the story for this data set. It
Yeah.
still has more maturing to do.
Right. And that could be some additional milestones, but it's outstanding and potentially very significant. So, from a corporate summary, I understand there's about 17.7 million common shares outstanding, 21.4 million on a fully diluted basis. As of this morning, June 24th, there's a market cap of approximately 160 million, and you have cash as of March 31 of about 138 million, cash or equivalent, which should be sufficient to take you to 2028 sometime. Any other matters that you'd like to cover before we conclude?
No, this has been, as always, a lot of fun. I feel we could talk for probably another 3 hours. But I'm just very grateful for the opportunity. And yes, we share your cautious optimism. I think my conclusion is it looks as though CRB-701 is clinically active. I think that bit is, I think we're very comfortable. I think what remains to be seen is education around the market size and opportunity. And of course, the data itself within this registrational study needs to be convincing enough ultimately for the regulatory authorities in order to get this drug into patients' hands.
Of course. So I just have a disclaimer to make. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered a recommendation to buy or sell securities in Corbus. Corbus is a clinical stage pre-commercial biotech company, which should be considered a high-risk investment. So please do your own due diligence and speak to your financial advisor before making an investment decision. And finally, I am independent of Corbus, and I'm not being paid by them for making this podcast, although I am a shareholder and having last purchased shares in Corbus after the data at ASCO when the share price had plummeted to about the $8 range. And with that, thank you so much, Yuval. A pleasure.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to the listeners. I appreciate the time they took to listen.